Welcome, astute researchers, to video 2 for research methods. Like last time, we talked a little bit about COVID. Today, let's introduce the idea by talking about, or our topic rather, by talking about cures for COVID. How do you know what works? How do you know what to trust? People could offer everything from, turn around 4 times in the sun to the latest offering from one of the pharmaceutical companies. There are lots of things out there that people are touting as cures for COVID. Which ones work and how do you find that out? Well, that, my friends, is what we're doing here in class. We're figuring out what are the ways to find these things out. What are the ways to understand? Another example, I listened to a podcast the other day from a really famous herbalist, and he talked a little bit about how he listens to plants and the plants tell him things. And so before you think that that is absolutely kooky, one way you could approach this is thinking that maybe we don't know all of the things. Maybe there's some things we don't understand. Maybe there's some possibilities that we haven't been used to getting in our culture, etc. And so maybe he can listen to plants. However, so if he listens to plants, then you have to figure out, well, is what he says true? And how do you know that? How do you find out? You have some data that say the things that he's saying are also found in other cultures, or there are lots of cultures that use the same plants for the same problems. Some other data say that you can do experiments on these plants to find out if they really do the thing that he says they do. So that's another example of what we're talking about today, which is how do you know and how do you find out? So, how do you know is answered with a word called or the word epistemology. The word isn't called epistemology. Okay, the word epistemology means that it's sort of like the study of how people find out the truth. How do you know stuff? Epistemology, different ways of knowing stuff. Science is one method of finding out stuff, or an epistemological method that is focused on one way of finding out truth, which is called empiricism. We'll talk about that in a second. And so today you're going to learn about how you find out stuff. Science is about systemic observations, systematic observations. That's what I meant to say, right? Just say I said that, okay? Science is about systematic observations. That's what it was. And we're going to break down what does systematic observation mean? And then this idea of operationalizing is going to come up throughout the semester. But I just want to jump in right away, all caution thrown aside, we're just going to jump in and talk about operationalizing right now. So when you have systematic observations, what that means is that you are measuring something or observing something in the same way every time. And so, for example, if you're going to weigh yourself and you're going to track weight change over the course of a couple weeks, you're going to want to weigh yourself at the same time every day, wearing the same clothing or not wearing clothing, however you choose to weigh yourself is your thing, right? But you don't want to be dressed in a parka one day and then dressed in a bikini the next day. That doesn't make any sense scientifically, because we know that you're going to weigh heavier in one area and not in the other. So you want systematic observations to be made so that you're making them using a method or using a system where what you're doing makes sense. When you operationalize, this means that you're figuring out how you measure the thing that you want to measure. And so if you're saying that what I want to measure is weight, and I say, okay, so how are you going to measure weight? And you'd say, well, I'm going to use this scale here. Then that's how you're operationalizing your construct. So weight is the construct or the idea, weight. And then the way you're measuring it is how you operationalize it. And so you'd say I'm operationalizing weight by using a scale. So the scale is how I operationalize my construct of weight. So epistemology is a way of knowing. And so there are various ways of knowing. We could use empiricism, authoritarianism, intuition, rationalism, pragmatism, and revelation, something that most of the world doesn't acknowledge really as an epistemology. So here are some of the different epistemologies. We'll just break them down. Empiricism is the one we'll talk about the most because this is the one that the scientific method is focused on. We use empiricism. Our culture is very, very oriented to empiricism. Not all cultures are as empiricist as we are. And so that's something to know, is that it's in part a kind of a cultural thing. Western culture is very empirical. Empiricism means basically I see it, so I know it's true. I can see it in front of me, show me the data. That's an empirical statement. My senses tell me. I measured it systematically. When you're measuring something systematically, that means that the measure you're using is reliable and valid. When it's reliable, it gives you the same observation or the same measure for each thing that you give it that is the same. And so if I use a ruler to measure my height, it's always going to be the same unless something really drastic happens to me between time 1 and time 2, right? And then you can say, well, and I know my ruler matches the standard of what the ruler should match. If I just rip off a piece of paper and then pretend that that's 8 inches, and then use that as a measure, it may or may not be 8 inches, so it may or may not be valid, right? So if the measure is valid, then we know for sure it is that your 8 inches really is 8 inches, or that your scale really measures 1 pound when there is 1 pound put on it, or that the questionnaire you took really measures anxiety instead of measuring liking of spinach, right? And so when you're doing an empirical study, what you're looking for are things that you can measure, things so you can say, I saw it, I observed this, therefore it is true. Authoritarianism is about authority. So if the authority said it, then it's true. We hear this all the time, and we all use this. Well, so-and-so said it. And so we all recognize that so-and-so must be an expert. So it's obvious that it's true. So Dr. Fauci said it, Dr. X said it, it was in a book. Any reliance at all on authority is authoritarianism. The weakness here is that, well, what if the authority is wrong? They could be wrong. And then you just would have to say, well, I thought he knew what he was talking about, but it turns out he didn't. Intuition is where you say it's just as obvious. This is common sense. It seems like this is how it is. It just feels right. It's intuitive. Okay, so that's what intuition is. Rationalism, logical, deductive. You derive B from A using logic. And so when we talk about deduction or deductive reasoning, we're really talking about rationalism. So one of the weaknesses there is that your logic might not be founded on correct principles. And so if you're not using correct principles, then what you derive from your not correct principles might not be correct. Pragmatism is sort of the American way because we just love to say, well, it works. So you just do what works. That's pragmatic. And so what we measure is it useful in explaining the world? What are the results? Are the results helpful? And so we can be very pragmatic in how we make decisions. And we can say we use pragmatism as a method of knowing something is true. So one of the weaknesses here, though, is that the short term might differ from the long term. So it might be useful in the short term, not useful in the long term. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a true thing. One example is, so right now I have this frozen shoulder problem. And one of the things that I wanted to do at first was just hold it still and not move it because movement created pain. And so that was like a nice short-term solution. And it seemed pragmatic, it worked. It stopped the pain. except the problem is that made the whole thing worse. And so the idea with a frozen shoulder is that using it and stretching it actually won't damage it, even though it does hurt. And so it's better for me to exercise it and stretch it than it is for me to keep it still. Revelation is basically the method where you know something is true because God told you so, or the Holy Ghost told you so. There are no weaknesses to this method. This is the way to find the ultimate truth. Here you can know for yourself. Everyone can know for themselves. You don't have to rely on an authority. You don't have to rely on your senses, which can sometimes deceive you, or you don't have to rely on measurement that sometimes is not accurate. You don't have to rely on knowing all of the things so that you develop and maintain an excellent experiment. You don't have to rely on anything, but you can know in a very deep and profound way that something is true. So, who's responsible for identifying truth? And that would be you. You are responsible for identifying truth in life as a whole, in general. You can't blame other people. You can't say, I was just following orders, or I read it on the internet, therefore it's true. It's important for you to be able to identify where you get your information. And so, this is another big thing that we do in psychology, along with other sciences, but particularly in the science of psychology. We are really, really interested in identifying where we got each piece of information that we use. So we're taking responsibility for what we promote as truth by pointing to our references. And so as scientists, we make references to our sources. And so if I say something like, I've heard that vitamin D is really helpful for COVID, and someone says, well, how do you know? And then I would point to the empirical evidence. And so I'm using empiricism as how I know. And I could say, here are about 60 articles that are in the literature now that say vitamin D helps with COVID. And so I can use in-text citations in an article that I write in the body of the article. And then at the end of the article, I will list all those references that I used as I created that article. And so that way I'm pointing to where I got my information. I'm taking responsibility for it. And then I'm telling you, hey, if you want to go find the same information, this is where I found it. So you can check up on me and make sure that what I said really is based on those sources, and that I'm being honest in my representation. And so being able to access or refer to or list sources in psychology as a science is very, very important. And we're certainly going to talk more about that this semester. So, what is the scientific method then? Based on empiricism, right? The scientific method, therefore, is a method of finding truth that uses systematic observations, measurement, experiment, and relies on formulating hypotheses and then testing those hypotheses. We're going to talk a lot about all of these ideas in upcoming videos. I just want to introduce you to them here. Systematic observation is where you are using a method to observe things. So here you are in a class called Research Methods. The method is how you're doing it. How do you do research? What method do you use? Well, here's what we're going to talk about is what methods we use to do research. So that's why we're calling it research methods. Systematic observation is a method. We measure things, we experiment, and we hypothesize. We make educated guesses based on previously collected data that then we can test to see, is this true or is this not true? So to sum up, there are many ways of finding truth. Psychology uses the scientific method, which relies on the epistemological method of empiricism. I see it, therefore it is true. Show me the data. Okay. The scientific method is what you will learn how to use as you work through this course and as you write research proposals. and as you work on your thinking so that you can become more scientifically minded. Systematic observations, measurement, experiment, hypotheses, empiricism. Great. See you next time.